see the sun go down and we're inside.
I know.
I think I'm gonna get a sun lamp.
All right, I think, oh, we're waiting for one more. All right, Council President Allen is back. So with that, I will reconvene with our work session. And so I'm going to hand it over to our City Manager, Robbie Hammond, who will introduce the staff in the presentation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mayor. We're excited to be able to share some of the progress that has been made as we continue to kind of digest House Bill 2001 and the implementation for the city. Colin and Laura have done an amazing job getting us this far. There's a lot more work to come. So I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to Colin Cooper.
Thanks very much, Robbie, and good evening, Mayor Callaway and councilors. And again, for the record, Colin Cooper, Planning Director for the Community Development Department's Planning Division. I'm joined this evening by Laura Kelly, Project Manager in the Planning Division as well. And what I wanted to do is give just a brief, quick contextual framework and reminder of where we've been and some of the just recent past events. And then Laura will lead this work session through. We've basically started this project about 24 months ago. And it really sort of, with the passage of the city's comprehensive plan that the council adopted in early 2018, which included a number of policies surrounding housing choice and increasing affordability. The Housing Hillsborough project, which formally got going in 2019's goal is to increase those opportunities for development for housing designed to meet the needs and preferences of both current and future Hillsborough households. And so in 2019, Laura had led and completed a community development code audit as our first step in this process to identify improvements and streamlining of regulations surrounded needing housing. And the first thing that we took and addressed was the accessory dwelling code. And some of you may remember passing those code amendments. And that was our first step in process. Then the second step was starting to look at, because the comp plan included policies to look for more diverse housing, was to start to look at opportunities to encourage the development of middle housing. And of course, that was about the same time that the Oregon legislature took up and then, of course, passed House Bill 2001, which is a very historic piece of legislation. And staff paused our effort, recognizing that we didn't want to be doing a bunch of work that wasn't consistent with the statute or the rules that would be promulgated by the passage of that statute. And so then that brings us all the way to just earlier this year in August. Laura and I came and spoke to the council and gave you an update on House Bill 2001 and where we were in the rulemaking process, a process that both Laura and I took part in. And that rulemaking process was completed in December 9th of 2020, when the Land Conservation Development Commission passed the rules, or the Oregon administrative rules, that implement House Bill 2001. So that gives us the rules of the road. And so now Laura's been working very diligently to move us and the community forward. And I hope that brief sort of background and context reminds everybody where we've been with the council in recent past and some of the other key points. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Laura, who's going to walk you through the work session tonight. And so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Colin. And thank you for having me here tonight to talk a little bit about the Housing Hillsborough project. I'm going to attempt to share my screen and we can get started on the presentation here. Can you all see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Thank you. Okay, so the Housing Hillsborough project, I'm going to give you kind of an overview and really dive into three primary topics here. We'll talk about implementation of House Bill 2001, what that looks like, what are the expected outcomes for the community, and a little bit about affordability and how this project addresses that. So recently, this council adopted its 2021 priorities, and this presentation is going to focus on two of them, affordability of housing and House Bill 2001 implementation. These two priorities are kind of the core of the Housing Hillsborough project. You may recall from our last presentation, although it was a little while ago, but there are two main goals of this project. Reducing barriers and finding ways to encourage middle housing, and of course, House Bill 2001 compliance. So I'm going to start with House Bill 2001 compliance or implementation, what it requires and how this will impact the city and how implementation will occur. I've provided you with the rules that Colin mentioned in your packet, as well as the model code, which is sometimes referenced in the rules. Just to give you probably a lot more detail than we're able to cover tonight, but I wanted to give you the context of really what we're talking about in this project. So House Bill 2001 requirements, as Colin mentioned, Hillsborough was looking for ways to reduce regulatory barriers to needed housing in our community. And at the same time, in 2019, the state was looking to do something similar, but statewide. So through House Bill 2001, the state now requires jurisdictions to allow middle housing in single-family residential neighborhoods. And they set parameters for the standards and procedures and criteria that can be applied to those development types. The idea behind that is to ensure that regulations are fair and don't present any barriers to the production of these housing types. According to the state, the intent of the requirements is to provide Oregonians with more housing choices. The legislation and the rules both are intended to reduce costly barriers to development. And by virtue of their smaller size, many of these housing units are likely to be more affordable when they are developed. Now, this slide has a lot of information on it, so I'm just going to point out a couple of things here. The first is that we have a set amount of time to implement House Bill 2001, and that date, drop dead date, is June 30th, 2022. We're currently working with our Planning Commission. They serve as the advisory committee on this project. Then they're working through some discussions to provide us with a framework of the regulatory components that will comprise this project. The rules, as you probably read through, have some flexibility to them. So these discussions are really honing in on which options we want, which paths to take. And come summer, we will be undertaking a significant amount of analysis to really try and understand the impacts of those regulations and the choices that we are making in that regard, and in an effort to refine and adjust with the continued guidance of the Planning Commission. The summer and fall is also expected to focus on code refinement and public education and policy development. We'll begin the formal process of adoption no later than the beginning of 2022, when the Planning Commission will assume its regular role with public hearings and the like. So put a different way, there are three parts to this project, and we're currently focused on the development part, determining which regulatory paths to take based on the state's rules. And in summer and fall, we're going to switch to more analysis and refinement of regulations and begin to talk about programs and policies and incentives. The summer and fall is when we expect to release the public draft of the Community Development Code so that we can we'll have a lot of time to receive feedback and just have some discussions with Planning Commission and City Council and work towards refinement and finalization. Beginning next year, again, we'll then go into the code adoption phase. So I just wanted to focus on one of these items here. I'll talk about the programs, policies, and incentives piece in a little bit, but this is to focus your attention on the task of evaluating paths. As I mentioned, the Planning Commission is working through a number of key topics and questions that are associated with the state's rules and providing staff with some really important direction on what to do with them. And the main component of these work sessions is really to determine whether it is enough to comply with the state's rules or whether there are ways for the city to go beyond. And if so, whether those ways are something that the city should look into. And questions that the Planning Commission has been looking into are, are there ways to make housing even more feasible to develop, particularly middle housing? And so this guidance is helping us to with a framework for establishing our regulations. So what does this all mean for Hillsborough, and what can we expect from implementation? The last work session we had on this topic, as Colin mentioned, it was partway through rulemaking, and there were still a lot of unknowns. And as of December, we now have the adopted rules, and so we've really been able to dig into these questions. First and foremost, we know that House Bill 2001 will apply to most residentially zoned lands and likely several mixed-use zones as well. I say likely because the state is still formalizing an interpretation on mixed-use lands, but we expect that interpretation to come in the next couple of weeks. And from what we understand, we expect all of the areas that you see on this map, either the light or the dark orange colors, will be affected by HB 2001 and need to be brought into compliance. So more than half of the area that's subject to House Bill 2001 is in a zone called the SFR 7, single family residential, 7,000 square foot minimum lot size. So I thought it would be instructive to just focus in on this particular zone to look at how implementation of HB 2001 might affect a zone like this. So as you can see on the blue part of this slide, it shows you what the current housing stock is, just specific to this zone. And what you'll see is that about 90% of the housing stock in this zone is detached single family houses. And so let's take a look a little bit into why that might be the case. Currently, the regulations for SFR 7 allow for detached single family outright on any lot that's at least 7,000 square feet. And it also allows for an accessory dwelling unit. In fact, anywhere in the city where a detached single family dwelling is allowed, an accessory dwelling unit is also allowed. But middle housing is a little more complicated. It's more limited. It is allowed in some regards, but there are two limiting factors. Excuse me, that's my cat. Two limiting factors here. One is lot size. The more units that you are looking to develop in the SFR 7 zone, the more land area is required of you. And the second is procedural. For most of these housing types, a planned unit development process is required in order to develop the housing. In the case of duplexes shown in the yellow or orange there, the PUD option is available. There is also an option of being part of a very large, well, a rather large subdivision, and of that subdivision, a limited number of lots could be developed as duplex. So between the size limitations and procedural requirements, again, we do still see this development happening in zones like the SFR 7, but as you saw from the last slide, it's not comparable to the detached single family. So HB 2001 requires that for the same 7,000 square foot lot, the detached single family dwelling and accessory dwelling unit, that would still continue to be allowed. But middle housing would be allowed at the same size lot, and it no longer would require a large subdivision or planned unit development process. These housing types could be developed by right on as a new construction or even through conversion of an existing dwelling. So looking at this a different way, what can be built on a 7,000 square foot lot in the R7 zone today? Well, right now it's a detached single family dwelling, and again, an attached or detached accessory dwelling unit. But in the future, what's going to be allowed by right on that same 7,000 square foot lot in the R7 zone are all of these options. And if you're looking at this thinking, this is a pretty dramatic change, you're right. I would say that there are a couple of things to keep in mind when you're thinking about the expected impacts of these changes, though. Yes, the city will be opening up dramatically more area to the possibility of middle housing development, but we don't have any expectation that this will change the amount of households that will be needed in Hillsborough, that will need housing in Hillsborough. We still expect the same number of housing units will be required, and there will be different kinds of housing that's desired. We expect there will still be a substantial amount of single family and multifamily, just as we see now. But what this will do is provide an opportunity to develop different housing types and in potentially different areas than we had previously assumed. The second point to keep in mind is that the city's allowance of middle housing doesn't always equate to the ability to develop middle housing. There are factors that are out of the city's control that might prevent this development from happening. For example, some neighborhoods have private covenants, CCNRs, that prevent the development of additional housing on a property. So even if the city allows it, the private covenants may prevent it, and there is nothing the city can do about that. Another factor.
I'm sorry, this is Councilor Alcare.
Mhm.
This may be not even a factor here, but are these considered for home buying, townhomes, cottage cluster, triplex, or are these going to be for a rental?
They could be. The townhouses certainly could be. They are on individual lots by definition. So they are more commonly the form that you would use for, of these housing units, they would be the form that you would most likely see as ownership housing. The other housing types are typically located on a single lot, so a number of units on an individual lot, and those are commonly left as a single lot. They're infrequently platted as condominiums, in which case they could be sold, but that again is fairly infrequent. The city mostly at this point, by a large margin of all of these housing types, mostly sees townhouses. So at the rate we currently have these being developed, ownership potential is certainly a possibility.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we talked about CCNRs. Another factor that might prevent the development of these housing types is financing. We know that middle housing, and particularly at a smaller scale, can be difficult to find financing for development. This may continue to tip the scales toward detached single family and ADUs. And from a regulatory perspective, that's not something the city can control. So this is why we're really focused in on making these housing types as easy to develop as possible. So let's look at what's in the city's control. Our standards and procedures are going to be updated in a number of ways. You can see a list here that it's a range from, where they're allowed to the size of the lot, and clear and objective standards that will take the discretion out of the process. How much parking can be required, and we talked about this last time and it hasn't changed. It's going to be no more than one parking space per dwelling unit can be required of middle housing. There are also a couple of rules that relate to master planned communities, which is kind of a new term. I don't know if you saw that in the rules, but the state defines master planned communities as areas that are 20 acres or larger in size. That what we're really talking about are places like Witch Hazel Village South, the new urban growth boundary expansion area. That would be considered a new master planned community. And then existing master plan communities like South Hillsborough. These have slightly different rules where we are required to plan for infrastructure at higher densities in new master planned communities like Witch Hazel Village South, and then to allow in both of those areas to allow middle housing, and existing master plan communities have slightly different rules where we're allowed to allow duplexes in undeveloped portions of existing master plan communities. But once those areas are developed, they're treated like any other part of Hillsborough that's subject to House Bill 2001. In other words, you could add on to your home and develop middle housing in those areas that are already developed in existing master plan communities. We'll be talking a lot more about master plan communities as this project goes forward. I just wanted to make you aware that there are some slightly different rules for those areas. So at the end of the project, the city expects to have, well, we will have updated standards and procedures designed to encourage the development of a greater variety of housing types. That's in line with the city council priorities. And as Colin mentioned, our comprehensive plan goals and policies around housing opportunities, housing choice, and support of increased housing densities. As I mentioned in the beginning, though, this project has two goals, and one is HB 2001 implementation, but the other is to find ways to further encourage middle housing, and particularly to encourage middle housing to be more affordable. In other words, we've talked a lot about the regulatory side, how middle housing is going to be allowed and how standards and procedures are going to be revised so that middle housing and single family are able to be developed in a similar way. And this alone is expected to go a long way toward making middle housing easier and less expensive and more feasible to develop. But again, is that good enough? And can we encourage deeper affordability or encourage the development of more units of middle housing, perhaps by establishing incentives or policies or programs or something else? Getting ahead of myself. These are questions that are going to be analyzed in this project at a later part. And we'll have a cross-disciplinary team of city staff and consultants that will be looking at a couple of issues that are provided specifically in House Bill 2001. We'll be bringing some recommendations and considerations on affordability at that time. And part of the reason is that prior to adoption of our code amendments, the city will need to demonstrate compliance with this section of House Bill 2001 that requires the city to consider a couple of ways to increase the affordability of middle housing. And one thing to note that this is a requirement to consider. There is no requirement to adopt, and the city could always consider other options at the same time, but we must consider these three things. So again, this will be part of our work sessions later this year, and we'll have more on this at that time. So to wrap up here, the key takeaways for this particular point that we're at in this project is that you should anticipate more housing choices, especially more affordable choices as a result of this project. And there are going to be impacts to our residential zones. Most are impacted as well as some of our mixed use zones. Expect standards and procedures to change. And even with all of those efforts, there are still some things that are out of our control. There are non-regulatory factors that may prevent the development of these housing types. And we are focused on the regulatory, especially at this stage, but it's not the only focus of the Housing Hillsborough project, particularly as we go on. And analysis and discussion about incentives and programs will be coming to you later this year. So that is what I have for you tonight, and I'd be happy to take questions.
This is Councilor Alcare. I know with Habitat, when they were considering building and had community meetings, that there were a lot of people who were opposed to having an affordable housing project in their area. This is a little bit different, but you showed us a map of a lot of residential. Are you anticipating that any of these people are going to be angry? And if they do get angry, are they going to have a right to say that they don't want this kind of housing in their neighborhoods?
It's an interesting question, and certainly we are aware of some degree of discomfort or pushback from neighborhoods around various housing types and affordability levels. One thing that this bill mandates is that all middle housing go through a clear and objective process, a non-discretionary process. And typically what that means is that there is there's no public hearing. Certainly that is off the table as a just standard by right project. It could be that a project might have something specific that would push it into a public hearing, but for the most part, these will not be seeing public hearings at all. So that reduces both the amount of public notice that is provided to the community, and accordingly the opportunity to sway a project one way or another. So if these are being approved at the administrative level, there would not be an opportunity for the public to weigh in on whether or not approval should be granted.
Well, but that may not prevent them from coming to city center, to one of our council meetings, to complain. So I'm just kind of I want to get a grip between what you're saying and the potential of what we've seen from people who are angry about what's going on in the neighborhood.
Yes, there is the regulatory reality and the political reality I think we're talking about here.
Mhm.
There is a difference.
Hey, Laura, I have a question. It's Counselor Pace.
Hi.
I heard your cat, and I think your cat is equally upset as I am about.
She's sleeping now, by the way.
Good.
Okay.
I'm relieved. I'm very concerned about what this will do to our infrastructure with roads, traffic, sewer, water, schools. Like if just 15 homes convert to duplexes, and they each have just one kid, that's a whole new classroom, right, in a school and in the same neighborhood. It seems to be, I get their intent, but what it would do to cities across Oregon, I think the infrastructure would be really strained. And so what happens to us as a city if we don't play? If we say no?
Yes, we're required to. We have the option of doing nothing, and then the city would impose its own set of regulations, its own set of standards that the city would need to play by, and that I provided to you as the model code. So that would be what would be in effect. So this gives us the opportunity to develop our own standards.
Okay, that makes sense. And then the other question I had is, if we figured out what what areas were allowed to be developed, and we took that number that could come from there, let's say we had one single family home that could be converted to a fourplex, right? And we put those 4 homes somewhere else, or we developed an area, and in that area, instead of single family homes, we said fourplexes or whatever. Can we somehow do the number, but in a different way? You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I mentioned that there is an awful lot of analysis coming in this project, and one of the key pieces that we are going to be undertaking, actually starting fairly soon, but it's going to take a little while, is an analysis about how much development to expect in different areas of the city. That will help inform our technical analysis around infrastructure, how much we should be planning for, what should change in our infrastructure planning. In terms of service providers and others, school districts, for example, they are very aware that this is coming, and we will need to be working with them to share those findings about our expectations for development. We certainly don't have a crystal ball, but we do have the opportunity to take a look at what might be some reasonable expectations for, again, it's not an increase in number of units that we're expecting, but it may be a shift in the location of those units and the density as related to infrastructure. So, with all of that being said, there are some conversations that are needed here, and they will be, ongoing through this project and beyond, because we really, we don't expect on day one that this will, open the floodgates on a lot of new development. But, over time, as we start getting a better understanding of who's using this and where and how, that will really help us refine all of those conversations and all of that planning work. So I think this is something that we're going to be talking about for a long time.
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
It-
And for the record, I'm a team player, but I just, I'm just trying to figure out a way to meet the need, but be able to have our infrastructure ready. Like if we're building new construction, let's get the infrastructure ready and handle that versus taxing what we already have. So.
Thank
you.
Laura, this is Rick Van Beveren, Councilor Van Beveren. It'd be interesting to see for you guys to map those areas that have CCNRs that won't be subject to this, and kind of map where you think the potential is for this type of development to occur in our city, so that we have an idea of what to expect. I don't expect that this is going to be happening overnight either. I think it's going to be a very, very gradual process. Without incentives, it doesn't seem the product type that we see in the marketplace today, let's say in South Hillsborough. Now, townhomes are, we just approved new townhomes. So that's what people want because they're, more affordable, I think. They're not in the affordable classification that I would call middle housing. I mean, they're still starting in the 300s and 400s, I think 400s. But it would be interesting to see where this is likely going to go in our city. And it'd also be interesting to see, as I mentioned to the mayor, some sort of really well done project that could demonstrate what can happen in a way that will relieve maybe some of the anxieties people have about, oh my God, it could be a fourplex or whatever. I mean, design can do an awful lot to curb appeal and that sort of thing, to alleviate people's concerns about property value and that sort of things. And in fact, in some areas, I think it could actually probably have a positive effect on property values and things. So I'm optimistic. I think it's going to be good. I just wonder if builders are going to see it as an opportunity. I think they will once they're pushed into no place else to go.
Well, and I will say that the home builders were very much behind the passage of House Bill 2001, and were front and center in the rulemaking process. So they're very well aware of it. And I think your question about who acts on it and in what quantities is a really interesting one. And if there is some outreach and demonstration that can be done, it's a compelling idea. So we'll talk about that.
I have a quick question. The
Please.
part about the incentives, is that a requirement or a recommendation?
Yeah, there are 3 specific incentive type. I lump everything under the incentive category, but we're really talking about fees specific to that are assessed on new housing, mostly new housing, and conversions as well. So it's that we are required to consider reducing or waiving those fees, system development charges, for example, property taxes, with the idea that those might help middle housing pencil if those fees were reduced. there are those 3 specific items, and beyond that, we are not required to consider anything. As I mentioned, we could if we wanted to, but we will, by the end of this project, before adoption, need to get to the point where we can say to the state that we have considered those 3 specific items. And again, this is going to be coming with some analysis and recommendations to City
Okay.
Council.
Right, right. So it sounds like that analysis report will be another big stop and reflect kind of a moment. So, and then to follow up on Councilor Alcair's question, just based off of those charts and graphics that you showed, like the nice graphics that demonstrated what they each would look like, it sounded like the only other additional opportunity to be a homeowner was probably in the townhomes, reflected in the townhomes model. And the others looked like they lent themselves to someone coming in, owning that property with those buildings, and then possibly becoming rentals, correct?
Yes, well, with the exception of that condoized approach that I mentioned, where we have seen individual units become condominiums, and those can be for sale. And
Okay.
as I mentioned, that's not super common, but it isn't, it does happen.
Happens, yeah.
At this point, those are the options, but the Planning Commission is considering whether to make any of these, whether to define any of these units as detached products. That's kind of a brain stretch to think about a duplex being 2 separate units. We typically think of these things as attached, but it's an option that the state gave us, whether or not to, whether to define these units as attached or detached. And if so, and if there is a passage of legislation sponsored by Habitat for Humanity that is being, I shouldn't say sponsored by, but that's at the legislature now, that would allow for subdividing or partitioning of individual units of middle housing that are developed under House Bill 2001. If that passes, and if the city decides to allow for detached units, or possibly if the legislation allows partitioning of attached units, then we could see more ownership opportunities than we know of now.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead.
Anthony, go ahead, Councilor Martin. I was just going to ask if there were any other questions.
Oh, well, Mayor, I have a couple.
All right.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was great. I do have a couple, so I want to echo some of the comments. I really appreciate the comment about making sure that we're really aware of the impact on our infrastructure and making sure that we're looking at where we can handle it. I also really want to echo Councilor Van Beveren's comment about knowing where the CCNRs are, particularly because a lot of that SFR 7 that I saw, even just rough kind of knowing-ish where HOAs are, that is a bit of that land, and that can't be unlikely, less likely to be developed, I should say. And that's definitely a concern here. I'm really glad to hear the potential of looking forward to those innovative law partitions. That was one of the things I was going to bring up. A couple notes that I'd want to see of, looking at that code. My understanding is you can either adopt the state code, you can adopt something more lenient density-wise than the state code, or you can prove that your design standards are such that they're applied equally to more middle housing and single family. And that third option is really what we're aiming for. Is that correct or no? It'd be good to understand that.
Yeah, so what the state has laid out is a model code that a city could choose to implement, although its primary function is to as we were talking about previously, impose something on a jurisdiction that is not in compliance. Most jurisdictions are opting to create their own standards, and the state's rules have requirements about how those compare to detached single family standards in the same zone. So for design and they're a little bit different between design standards, things like how many windows and what does your porch look like? Those standards are set out in the model code, and a city has the chance to be either to use the design standards in the model code or to come up with their own, as long as they are no more restrictive than the model code. And for siting standards, the state gets very prescriptive about siting, which basically entails things like placement of the structure on the lot, so setbacks and access and that sort of thing, and lot size. And so those kinds of things are set out by the state, and there are little offshoots that we could take around siting standards, particularly lot size and density. We probably won't be taking that path because it would likely result in less development of middle housing, and is a complicated it's a complicated process that as of yet the Planning Commission has not seen a reason to go down. So there are a number of different paths that are laid out in the state's rules, and the model code could just we could just ignore all of that and just adopt the model code. But the reason that we're going for the state's rules, I call them the minimum compliance standards. The reason that we're going down that path is so that we have the ability to customize our regulations and our standards for our community.
Right. Thank you for that. And a couple of things I want to make sure that are looked at. So we talked about how design standards, there's could be some citing ones. I didn't quite see well, I'm obviously not the expert and you all are. I didn't quite see the prescriptive nature on the citing, and maybe that was me, but does that mean that we're going to be looking at things like setbacks and height limits as a city and talking about those?
So for you're right. For some of the citing standards, it is basically no more. The requirement is don't be any more restrictive than what you require for detached single family. And for some citing standards, it is more prescriptive, like access for townhouses have to be no more than 20 feet or whatever. Sorry.
Yeah.
Something
No,
like that. So,
yeah.
So we could look at those things, and actually the Planning Commission is just starting in on those conversations of whether we should be looking at those things. They are I don't want to jump the conversation, but they are interested in the idea that we calibrate our standards to these middle housing types and not just be satisfied with what applies to single family should also apply to middle housing. They're interested in making sure that development is feasible regardless of the housing type. So what works for single family may not necessarily work for cottage clusters, for example.
That's
So-
really good. Oh,
Sorry, Anthony. Man,
you can go ahead. Yeah, I have a couple more, but you can go ahead.
got a little one. It kind of goes with yours. But so in an area where that's mostly ranch houses, is there a limit on how high? Can it be like 2-story? Can it be 3-story? Are there restrictions around the city of where some kind of housing can be? And then I'll give it back to Anthony.
Yes, in all of these zones we're talking about, the city already has development standards, siting standards that and design standards that it applies to housing that's developed in that zone. And among them are setbacks and height limitations. Typically in a single family zone, you're looking at a 2.5-story height limitation. Some zones are a little bit higher, but that's pretty standard. And so that applies right now primarily to detached single family. And to Councilor Martin's question, should that height limit be examined to make sure that it works for middle housing as well? So something like a townhouse may not be able to fit very well on on a lot without going higher. So those are things that the Planning Commission is talking about looking into.
I'm really glad to hear that the Planning Commission is looking to calibrate, not just makes single family kind of blanket apply to middle housing, but have that integrative. I would really push for looking at setbacks and height standards. Those definitely seem like important things. The other one too is looking at kind of the HOAs across our community, the planned unit developments that come up that we see as council. One of the things that we see, and I feel like we had to deal with over by Orenco Woods Nature Park, is this creation of kind of odd land, these weird little pockets that just can't be developed. So a HOA gets created to be able to maintain it, and it does or doesn't get maintained by the HOA, depending on the circumstance. I'd love to see something that allows for those odd sized lots when like to avoid creating HOAs when not necessary. We often talk about the community benefits that are applied, but those community benefits are privatized, are internalized on the HOA. And so I would argue those aren't community benefits often. And so that's one of the things I would love to have us look at the code with that in mind, of trying to see, when we're creating an HOA, that it's not just because it's the easiest way to pack as many houses on as a developer can, or because it's the easiest way to kind of go through our development process. Let me see. I had one more thing. I wrote it. In terms of incentives for affordability, you said that was going to be one of our conversations. And Robbie, just to get a handle on that, is that going to be more holistic, talking about kind of a little bit of what we were talking about in the priority session, but also I probably see it in terms of inclusionary zoning and kind of density bonuses or things like that related to affordable housing. Are those going to be on the docket when we discuss affordability later in the year?
Yes, I can't guarantee it would be in a work session about House Bill 2001, but it is something that we're talking about holistically. And yeah, that's exactly right. We would looking at at the same time as looking at some of those other tools that you just mentioned.
Okay, perfect. That was I wanted to do the plug about density bonuses, and it's good to know that we'll have another forum to look at that. Beyond that, I'm really grateful for what staff has done participating in the rulemaking process and making sure that we're looking at this as an opportunity and not just a requirement that the state made us do. So I really do appreciate that we're looking at it from that lens, and I look forward to the public participation. I'm sure other counselors have had many a conversation like I have with folks that run the gamut on this. So thank you.
I'll take an opportunity to jump in here. So first of all, I really appreciate your presentation and all of the work that's been done. I mean, gosh, more than a year now, to getting us to this point. I think these changes are actually exciting opportunities, and I understand the hesitation around infrastructure constraints. I'd be curious, in this kind of hypothetical map that we're talking about with covenants, if that could be something that's looked at, right? I mean, so is the size of the sewer pipe in any given neighborhood, is that really a concern? How many units could it actually support, right? Because I wonder sometimes if we kind of overplay that card a little bit. I know, for instance, in the school districts, even though we've seen large population increases, the total number of kids within the Hillsborough school district has stayed relatively the same over the last 6 years, or even has gone down a little bit slightly. So I think that's important to address. I really like the idea of the cottage style homes. I like tiny homes. I'm an advocate of those, and I like the idea of incentivizing maybe ADUs through programs. One point of caution for me, though, is I want to make sure that we always have that future Hillsborough resident in mind that's going to be living in that space. In other words, if we're waiving fees for a development or redevelopment to happen, the price in which those are going to be sold at is the price in which the consumer is willing to pay. And so how can we make sure that they are actually benefiting on the other end of that? So for instance, I don't think that we should compromise on things like the energy envelope of the home, right? If anything, maybe we should incentivize development of those type of units, because that's going to result in savings of the homeowner over time, that Hillsborough resident. So I want that to be kept kind of in the back of the mind as we continue down this path. But great presentation. I'm excited that we got to this point. I know there's a lot more to discuss in the future.
That's a good one thing that you said, Kyle. Habitat makes sure to they build their houses, but they put state-of-the-art they do modifications, they do heating, they do everything that they can to make sure that that structure is going to require as much updating without considering more environmentally sound, more products that would last longer over time without a lot of cost to the homeowner.
I had one more thing I was hoping to ask. You talked about us looking at design standards. I really appreciate that. How in-depth is that conversation going to be? Specifically, I think about our kind of levels of articulation, the window design, that we have a lot of requirements when a house gets built. And I'm wondering how much we're really going to look at those and do a benefit of, how much is this benefiting the community if we have X numbers of articulation in the front of the house, the benefit to the community versus the cost to the a developer, remodeler, whatever it may be, especially in a lot of these single family home areas. It may just be a person who wants to, have an ADU or convert to a duplex and own half of it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and we have not yet gotten to the point of even broaching this subject with Planning Commission yet. That will be coming in about a month and a half, where we'll start talking about what to do about design standards. But it's kind of wrapped up in this question of what do you do about procedures? Because right now we have a design review process, a development review that looks at things like what kind of siding you're using, or how many windows you've got, and how big is your porch, and those sorts of things. And so we have standards, and we even have standards for most of these middle housing types. And when we have an applicant go through that process, it is typically a type 2 process. That means it is reviewed at an administrative level, but it's often associated with duplexes and triplexes and cottage clusters and quadplexes and townhouses, but not detached single family. So when you start thinking about how to set up design standards that apply to all of these housing types, including detached single family, and what kind of process applies to all of those housing types, including detached single family, you start getting into some interesting conversations about, do you continue to have a design review process, a type 2 process? Are there ways to lessen the standards or to simplify the standards so that it can be done through a ministerial process, like through a building permit checklist that is reviewed by the planning department? So those are some interesting conversations. I think we'll be, obviously providing you with some insight into how those are going in the coming months. But I don't have the answers at this point about how in depth they're going to go. But just know that those factors are going to influence where we land on both design standards and development review.
Thank you for explaining that. That actually really helped to think about that level of review. I appreciate that.
So
One thing,
I don't want to prolong the session too much, but it just occurred to me that from a developer's perspective, we could see in the future tear downs, of sort of homes and neighborhoods, and you could actually experience a gentrification, so to speak.
Yes, Rick. Yes, that's what I'm freaking out about. Yes.
Yeah, and I've seen it in other areas. You look around the metro area where there's a constrained supply, and the developers, of course, are looking for the least costly properties and the marginal properties, the ones that could be conceivably developed for a profit. And oftentimes those are the, in those areas where you see gentrification starting to occur on the margins. You see what I'm saying? And I don't know how to address that, but I'm a little concerned about that.
Well, and one of the ways we're at least starting to look at it is through some analysis of where we expect this development to occur, and is it occurring? Do we expect it to occur in areas that have risk factors for displacement or vulnerability to displacement? So we're actually going to be analyzing that fairly shortly in the coming months about what does it look like to implement House Bill 2001 in what neighborhoods, and are any of those neighborhoods vulnerable to displacement or gentrification? And that will provide us with some information to have these conversations about, whether there are interventions that the city can take on, can make to help prevent any of that or mitigate some of that. But at this point, we're starting with the analysis about what we expect to happen, or what best we can figure out what might happen here.
Thanks. I'm glad you're looking at it.
And one thing that, hi, this is Colin again. One thing that I'll remind everyone is, and Laura's touched on this a couple times, is the role the Planning Commission is playing as the advisory committee for the implementation. So they're really exercising these types of questions as Laura has described to you, and we will certainly have taken note of all the issues that you're raising here tonight. We'll bring that back to them as well and fold it back into their whole process. So they're actually holding special meetings on this, not so they can really focus on these topics, and Laura's leading them through some really good conversations that are, I think, asking similar questions, but this has been a real benefit for us tonight.
So Councillor Van Beveren said he didn't want to prolong this. I, on the other hand, feel no such constraints. I love this stuff. Laura, great presentation tonight. So I do have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. I want to preface all of this by saying I fully, firmly, strongly believe in the importance of home ownership. It is absolutely one of the ways that people are able to accumulate wealth. In fact, it is for most of us, it's our number one wealth, wealth asset. And it helps, with so many different things. And so I do like, the notion, of increasing the inventory in these manners, for that purpose. Of course, having said that, I'm curious because there are sometimes hidden fees, hidden costs with home ownership. A lot of times those have to do with HOA fees. And so typically, if you have just a few townhouses, even regardless if they're rentals or if they're individually owned, might they have their own, might they have HOA fees or some kind of common area fee, to pay for, the roof, or is that unique and individual to each different project? So it could be if Councillor Alcair and I, we share a common wall with the townhouse. We each take care of our own roof as is necessary in our own time. So common areas on townhouses or more individual. What do you anticipate?
Typically, those projects that have shared spaces, whether they are building features or land area, they will tend to develop. They will tend to create a homeowners association to deal with those areas.
Okay, thank you. And so, as we look to provide, housing options that are affordable, again, I am concerned by, those. They're not hidden in terms of, you don't know you're going to have them, but when you think about what can you afford, it sometimes that really puts an undue burden. I appreciated Councillor Alcair's concern about, angry constituents, who might have a project coming into their area. So there's two kinds of anger. One is, I don't like it and I didn't know. The other one is I don't like it. And so I would, down the road, really encourage us to over communicate. There's the technical requirements of X number of feet. And I would say, let's go more with the spirit and go even farther, because at least then we're able to communicate, in a proactive sense, and that does help us as we respond to constituents. I am concerned, some of our, in the area where I live, has larger lots. It has CCNRs that prohibit any, ancillary dwelling units. And so I worry that some of our areas that are, I guess, bound by CCNRs almost become a little bit more exclusive and a little bit more of an enclave, because there are other parts of the city where, they're just normal, regular neighborhoods, and houses can be raised and duplexes, triplexes put in. And there's nothing obviously you can do to change those CCNRs from a city perspective. But I would want to make sure that at the same time we're concerned about gentrification, we also recognize that depending on how the houses are built, some existing areas can become more exclusive because of a lower density and a larger lot, and prohibition from, adding more. And then my last question has to do and comment with the infrastructure, and Councilor Pace, addressed it. And I think of, the project down on the corner of, I believe it's East Main and Northeast 30th, where there was a 50s ranch style house on 0.48, almost a half an acre. And that house was raised, and in its place are 3 duplexes, and each half of the duplex, was $450,000. So again, it's $900,000 for both sides of a duplex is a lot of money. And I know, Councilor Martin and I talked about whether or not it's affordable, and it's more, what does it add to the inventory down the road as you begin to have more houses available, kind of in the market, when it's sold for a second and third time. But with that, what was originally there was a ranch house on a half an acre. And now we have basically 6 houses on that same lot. If that was repeated multiple times, how, do we and would we reach a capacity where the water lines don't have any more capacity, where the sewer lines don't have any capacity? Or are we really not likely to ever hit that full capacity, concern with sewer lines and water lines in residential? Again, I could think of, some of the areas just north of downtown where you have, larger lots and houses from the 50s and 60s, the ranch. If we started seeing this repeatedly, would we potentially reach, our max capacity and not be able to accommodate anymore? Or would we then have to put in larger infrastructure and larger capacity? So could we reach capacity? And in that case, by 2001, would we be required to put in more infrastructure?
Yeah, you've really hit at the heart of some of the infrastructure analysis and conversations that we're going to be having soon. It isn't a question I know the answer to right at this moment, but that is really the question. Does implementation of House Bill 2001 and the development that we expect to see from it result in any problems to our systems and to our service providers? And we're going to be addressing that question with we've already started conversations with internal staff about about this project and about implementation of House Bill 2001. And those conversations are going to continue until we, until we know how to address this. It's not just, adopt and hands off. It's really, what do we need to do to ensure that this is that this works, that it's not causing problems that we could have foreseen. Fortunately, as we've talked about, this is not something that we expect to see happening overnight. So those changes that we may need to make to our systems, we'll need to do some thoughtful planning about and figure out how to do this. But in terms of, does HB 2001 let us off the hook for development of these areas? The answer is no. If if it's an area that would allow for the development of a single family home, and we would allow that single family home to go forward, then the bill requires us to also allow middle housing. And that doesn't mean that infrastructure during the development process is ignored. Obviously, developers are responsible for infrastructure to some extent as well. That doesn't mean that they get a free pass. It's just, if the city is anticipating development in an area or could allow for development of single family homes, then also duplexes, also triplexes, et cetera.
Great, thank you. It's like takes me back to the good old days of planning commission. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yes, Councilor Pace.
Yeah, I have a question for Robbie. Robbie, I hear a lot from Laura and Colin that if they had a crystal ball, so they would make a prediction. So I was wondering, can we put that in the budget? Because they mention that a lot. If we could just get them a crystal ball and move on, I would appreciate that.
I was looking around for something in my office that I could hold up that looks like a crystal ball, but I can't find anything. So we'll look into that.
Okay, thank you.
You're muted, Steve.
Yeah,
It probably wasn't.
Robbie has an
listening
8 ball
to.
that he's behind, I think.
This is about the closest we come to. So anyway, thank you.
I have one question that could be dumb, but it's something that keeps gnawing at me every time we talk about HOAs and like townhomes and stuff. So one of the things you said, Laura, is that typically if there's shared walls, you said shared common areas and shared walls. So I'm going to focus on the shared walls part because the areas I get more. You said if there's a place with typically shared walls, there's going to be an HOA. And the reason why I think about that is I think about downtown Portland. I think about the East Coast where townhomes, row homes are really common. My understanding is HOAs are not prevalent in those. So what is it about our development code or Oregon's development code that kind of requires that to happen? What is that?
I see Dan lit up here. I'm wondering if he has an answer to this. Otherwise, I can tackle it.
Go ahead, Laura.
Okay. What I was attempting to get at is that shared features, shared building features, as well as shared land, is commonly something that an HOA would take care of. The roof is a good example where it's a single feature, or it can be a single feature. That's why this isn't in every case. It would make more sense for a homeowners association to be able to pool resources and be able to take care of that roof together. I see that Councillor Elclair has some comments or some information, insight into this. Do you want to take this one?
I can say this. I'm single. I'm not an HGTV. I watch it. I don't do it. So I don't have to worry about my siding because our HOA covers that. Our townhomes specifically, when detached homes don't have that same coverage. Also, they deal with our roofing, they deal with our gutters, they deal with painting our townhomes as well. So to me, that's a lot of benefit and worth the cost. There was a time when a lot of townhomes around 2008, 2009, a lot of residing had to be done because it wasn't done properly in the first place. Our site had to go through a lawsuit to get that done. And that was covered for townhomes and the carriage houses that were attached. was not covered for detached and they had to go for their separate lawsuits. So that's why it's good for townhomes to have the HOA coverage.
All right, I may unmute just briefly if I can add one final point to Laura's comment on that, both stemming from experience with the city and to a degree working for a contractor and a small scale home builder. But to your point, Councilor Martin, and to reiterate a part of what Laura shared, we within our code and in some cases within our conditions of approval of subdivisions or planning and developments where we have common building components, especially at scale or those open space areas, we will actually in some cases require the demonstration of the CCRs, which then in turn oftentimes create the homeowners association in its own right. So some of that will be back to that regulatory and review process evaluation that our planning team is undertaking, and where do we require some of that. But I'd also note back to some of your examples in terms of other larger metropolitan areas or at a smaller scale, it is very common, like in the case of a 2-unit townhouse where you have a common wall, and the mayor alluded to this earlier, where rather than a full-blown homeowners association, you have a common maintenance agreement between you and your neighbor that you share that wall or that roof or that exterior with. It doesn't come with really any less cost or complexities per se, maybe a little bit less on the management cost, but that is a different way that technically you will not see maybe the formation of a full-blown homeowners association itself, but it still has that kind of mutuality in terms of commitment to maintain that, because you in effect are sharing that wall. If the neighbor on one side abandons it or doesn't maintain it, that can lead to leaks and impacts and degradation on the other owner's side of the wall. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that all three were helpful. Thank you for sharing your experiences, Councilor Alcare. That was great. Yeah, that is helpful. The mutual agreement maintenance thing was one that I had kind of run across a little bit, but didn't fully understand. And I think you just made it click. So thank you.
Well, all right. I'm not seeing any other. Again, thank you, Laura. I think your presentation was really good, and I think it really, kind of kickstarted a really good conversation for us. And and I appreciated what you said is that this is going to be over a long period of time, and so we're kind of discussing it from a fire hose, but it's going to be more of a, it's going to be less volume and less force, as it rolls out. So anyway, with that, Colin, Laura, Robbie, anybody last comments? Councilor Pace, any last budgetary requests?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Okay. All right. So
Well, thank you all very much for this conversation. It's been really, really helpful. And we'll take this back to Planning Commission and let them know what's on your minds. And thanks very much.
last question, what's your cat's name?
Nadia, because she's kind of a
Nadia.
gymnast.
Oh, nice. All right. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Good night.